back to Seeing Dementia Differently. My name is Cece, and today I have a very special guest with me for part of our Carers Conversation series. Now, while Ian himself is not a young dementia carer, today we are going to be talking about the theme of sharing the diagnosis with family, and that is something that Ian does have experience with. So, Ian, would you like to introduce yourself a little bit more?
Yes, certainly, Cece. Okay, so my name's Ian, and I was married to Amanda, who you can see is over my right shoulder there. And unfortunately, she passed away last April. She had behavioural variant frontotemporal dementia. So, from the point of view of looking after our family, which was three children, um, it was obviously a major shock that we were dealing with.
You've mentioned, of course, you've got the daffodils behind you because they were Amanda's favourite. Would you like to tell us just a little bit more about her before the diagnosis so we can have a better picture of her in our minds?
Of course, no problem. So Amanda was a school cook up at the local primary school, and she wanted to do that because obviously when the children were young, it gave her the opportunity of having the time off and what have you in the sort of half terms and some holidays and what have you. She kept that going up until probably about 2013, somewhere around about there, and then sort of decided that she'd like to work into a sort of a commercial cafe just down the road. But that didn't quite work out. But hey, sometimes these things happen. But her primary sort of caring role was always towards the children and what have you. So she was very, very focused on that.
Lovely. Thank you so much for telling us a bit more about her. It's nice. I always like to, mention that dad's name is Neil and kind of share photos of him as well if I can. So as it feels like we're actually talking about them rather than just, this abstract kind of concept. And I think it's really healthy to still talk about the people that we miss. So yes. So thinking about when Amanda got the diagnosis now, what were your immediate thoughts? Firstly, of course, as her husband and partner, and then also as a father, what went through your mind?
Okay, well, it's quite an interesting conversation because when we first got the diagnosis, or should I say the first visit to the doctor, it was the standard 10-minute come on in and you have that quick conversation. And he turned around and said, I need to do a double appointment with you. I'd never heard of a double appointment before, didn't realise it existed.
Yeah.
But I'd like to understand what the issues are. Not so much she's changed, but how she changed and what are all the sort of little nuances and what have you. And on that second appointment, he also did MMSE, which is the mini mental state examination, I believe.
Yeah, that's right.
And I realised at that point that this was actually going to be quite difficult. It was a very low score, and between the first and second appointment, I'd asked Amanda's siblings, because she's the youngest of five, so we had four siblings that I could ask and say, please don't talk amongst yourselves, but write down what you've noticed with Amanda particularly, and her just a demeanour and everything. Basically, we all came up with the same sort of idea of the behavioural changes that we were noticing. And I spent quite a lot of time between those two appointments, spending a lot of time on the NHS trying to work out what was going on. And at that point, I actually came up with Pick's disease. So in some ways, I was a little bit ahead of what was going to happen at the second appointment. And when we were having that second appointment, the doctor, and we've been with the same doctor for sort of 30 years, and we're on first name terms, so it was very straightforward, it was very easy. He sort of suggested it might be FTD. And I said to him, well, I'd heard PICS, and he explained that basically the state of FTD is the new term.
Yeah.
So at that point, it was quite shocking because whilst I'd understood what PICS was about, I didn't understand what it was about, if that makes sense. I don't think anybody understands what it's
Yeah.
about until you're actually in the middle of it. But he didn't want to accept that straight away. He wanted us to speak to a neurologist. And he pointed us towards Queen Square in London.
Right.
So that was to pay privately. But to be fair, I wanted to know what we were dealing with. I'd had enough of a sort of insight to think this isn't good. I now want to actually understand what we're dealing with. So we then went to the Queen Square and we saw the neurologist there. And I can remember when Amanda was given the sort of diagnosis, she sort of chuckled. And she didn't obviously understand the severity of what the news had just been given to her. But I sort of now realise that was probably anosognosia, which is pretty much a hallmark trait within FDD. It became one of those sort of instances where I think we came back from town on the train and you could just feel that your world was sort of falling apart.
Yeah, you can feel that things are going to be changing soon, that there's going to be a lot of different adaptations and things in your life that you maybe didn't expect. And I wonder, how old were your children when this all happened? And did you choose to tell them straight away? Or did you have just some time for you two to process it and then tell the kids?
Well, they were 24, 26 and 28. So, you know, proper young adults. It was a very straight conversation because I'd actually also said to the children before, after the sort of the second appointment at the GP, this is what I think mum's got.
And of course, they're navigating a lot at that point in their own lives anyway. You know, as young adults, you might be thinking about things like buying a house, getting a new job, promotions at work, all things that, you know, you expected to be focusing on, and now you've been presented with this news as well. It can be quite devastating, I imagine.
Yeah, I think it was.
So now thinking about when you sat down or maybe just spoke to the children, how did that conversation go when you told them that mum had dementia, and specifically a rare form of dementia?
It was a pretty straightforward conversation. I don't think it was new news. It was just almost the confirmation of the news. And one always fears for the worst and hopes for the best. Well, this is fearing for the worst and actually now getting the worst. Interestingly, Amanda was never able to talk about the disease or her condition to the children. Now, whether that was because she didn't want to, or whether it's the maternal instinct of protecting your children, because you know we all do that, you know.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting actually, because Dad wouldn't really feel comfortable talking about it with my brother or I. You know, I'm sure he had conversations with Mum, but definitely in those earlier stages, we didn't know straight away what was going on. They chose not to tell us immediately, and because we were a bit younger, it's not like we had noticed really what was going on. The first symptoms were more sort of hidden, and only Dad knew about them, and of course Mum because he was telling her. So I think quite different in that, you know, you've all maybe been observing these slight changes, you've done your own research and kind of found out before you've got the diagnosis, whereas I think for us it was almost like we had no idea what was going to come from it, or Mum and Dad didn't, because we hadn't been able to do any research on it. So were there any questions? You know, you said that you guys had quite an open conversation about it. Were there any questions from their side that came up that you distinctly remember because perhaps you weren't sure how to answer them at the time, or they just felt quite emotionally heavy perhaps?
Those early days, we didn't really have too many questions. We were just, I think, getting used to what the diagnosis was about. When you get to sort of a couple of years down the road, like to 2022, somewhere around there, and then things started getting a little bit harder. Because I think at that point you've seen some deterioration, and you're now beginning to actually see it happening in front of you. And that's, I think, when the children find it harder as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it can be difficult, not just practically, because of course, you know, support needs might increase. There needs to be more, you know, one-to-one care at home and stuff like that. Or I know for Dad, it did get to a stage where he couldn't be on his own. That was just a risk to himself. So yeah, it's difficult practically, and then also it gets harder emotionally as it goes on as well, because you're trying to do this caring role. I think, you know, from my side as a child looking after their parent, caring for someone who is supposed to be caring for you. So it does feel very, very odd.
Role reversal, effectively, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And how did the conversations with your kids evolve as the dementia progressed? Because of course you've explained how the initial kind of conversation happened, that it felt quite practical, quite open.
I think we'd always kept a very open conversation about everything. I think it got harder as the disease progressed, but I think the hardest conversation as it progressed was transitioning into a care home.
Thanks for watching part 1. Don't forget to go and check out part 2 of our carers conversations with Ian as well.